1881. A dusty street in a boom town somewhere in the American Southwest. The whole thing was over in less than half a minute. 3 men were dead, 2 were wounded, and the men still standing were already trying to figure out what story to tell. That is where this begins. Not with the gunfight, with what came after. Because the gunfight itself was ugly, disorganized. Men fired from distances so close that powder burns showed up on the wounds. Some of the dead had not even drawn their weapons fully. One body fell in a narrow alley between 2 buildings. Another hit the dirt with his back to the wall. There was no dramatic standoff, no slow walk toward each other in the open sun. Just noise, smoke, confusion, and then silence. Within a week, none of that was the version people were reading. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. If you have not thought about how a story gets built from nothing, stick around. This one is worth understanding. And if you want more history that cuts through the mythology, consider subscribing. This channel does not do the comfortable version. Here's a question before we go any further. What is your favorite Western film or TV show? Drop it in the comments, because by the end of this, you might see it very differently. So how does a messy, ambiguous street brawl turn into a legend that 140 years later is still being made into films? The answer is not complicated, but it is uncomfortable. Start with the town itself. These settlements existed because someone had found something worth extracting. Silver, gold, cattle roots, land. Wherever money was flowing, people arrived faster than any structure could contain them. A town that had 12 residents in the spring might have 1,200 by autumn. There were no courts worth speaking of, no established families with generations of reputation behind them, no institutions anyone trusted. What filled that vacuum was reputation, and reputation needed stories. A man who controlled the narrative of a confrontation controlled the town's perception of who he was. And in a place with no history, perception was everything. Here is the first thing most people get wrong. They think the myth was created later, by outsiders looking back. That is not what happened. The myth was built immediately, locally, by the people directly involved. A man walks into the office of a local newspaper 3 days after a shooting. He is not a journalist. He has never written a word for publication. But he sits down with the editor and he talks for 2 hours. He describes what happened, except the version he describes has been quietly adjusted. The men who died were threatening him. He had no choice. The whole town was in danger. He and his companions had stepped in to protect people. The editor writes it down. Why would he not? This man is one of the most prominent figures in the community. He controls business interests the paper depends on for advertising. The story goes to print. Nobody on the other side of the fight is alive to contradict it. That is not an accident of timing. That is a pattern. Boom towns across the American West in the second half of the 19th century operated on a very specific power structure. The men who controlled commerce controlled the local press, not through formal censorship, not through government pressure, but through economic dependency. A newspaper in a town of 2,000 people had perhaps 4 or 5 businesses large enough to buy advertising space. If those businesses belonged to connected men or to the friends of connected men, the editor understood the boundaries of what was printable without anyone ever stating them directly. This created a press that was not lying exactly. It was selecting, emphasizing, omitting. A fight breaks out. 2 men are dead. The paper runs a story about heroic law-keeping. It mentions the dead men only by name, briefly, with no background. It does not mention that one of the survivors had a pending legal dispute with one of the deceased. It does not mention that the confrontation had been building for months over a land claim. It does not mention that at least one witness described the sequence of events very differently from the official account. What it does mention is the bravery of the men still standing. By the time anyone reads it, the story is already shaped, and shaped stories harden fast. But here's the problem. The local paper was only the beginning. The wire services existed by 1870. By 1880, telegraph lines ran to most major towns in the West. A story printed in a small-town newspaper could reach editors in New York, Chicago, and Boston within days. And those editors had a very specific hunger that the raw facts of a street fight could not satisfy on their own. Eastern cities in the 1880s were crowded, industrial, loud, dirty. The people reading newspapers in New York were working in factories or offices. They lived in neighborhoods where you could reach out a window and touch the building across the alley. They were exhausted by a kind of life that felt confined, managed, and unglamorous. The West represented something they desperately wanted to believe in: open land, individual action, a man standing alone against the forces of chaos. The idea that one person with enough nerve could walk into a dangerous situation and impose order through sheer personal force. This was not a geographic fantasy. It was a psychological one, and the newspapers feeding those Eastern readers understood exactly what sold papers. So a story about a confused street altercation between men with overlapping legal and financial grievances became something else entirely by the time it was republished in an Eastern paper. The nuance disappeared first, then the ambiguity, then the specific local context. What remained was the skeleton of the event, stripped clean and dressed in new clothes. A lawman, a threat, a reckoning. And this is where things change. The editors who ran those Eastern papers were not cynics. Most of them genuinely believed they were giving readers something true. They believed in the version of the West they were printing, because they needed to. Because the alternative was that the frontier was not a heroic landscape at all, but a place where violence was messy, grievances were petty, law was whatever the most powerful men said it was, and nobody was particularly heroic. That version was true, but it was not sellable. A miner sits in a boarding house in Pittsburgh in 1882, reading about a gunfight 3,000 miles away. He has worked 11 hours in a hole in the ground. His hands are raw. His back hurts. He owes 2 weeks of back rent. The story he is reading tells him that somewhere out there, a man faced down a gang of outlaws on an open street and won through skill and courage. He reads every word. He reads it twice. He cuts it out and keeps it. He needs that story to be true. That need is not something to look down on. It is very human. The question is, who was exploiting it and why? Here's a thing that almost nobody discusses when they talk about the mythology of the Old West. The men who were being turned into legends frequently participated in the process. Actively? Eagerly? A survivor of a notable confrontation understood something quickly. His reputation was now an asset. It could be rented. Newspapers wanted interviews. Traveling shows wanted appearances. Writers wanted to sell dime novels with his name on the cover, or a name close enough to his that readers would make the connection. The more dramatic the published version of his life, the more valuable his name became. So he cooperated. He told stories. He did not correct the exaggerations. Sometimes he added to them. A fight where he had been one of several participants became, over time, a fight where his role was central. A moment of chaos became a moment of clear decision. The number of men opposed to him crept upward with each retelling. The danger became sharper. The resolution became cleaner. And nobody was checking. No journalist from this era was traveling back to these towns to interview witnesses. The witnesses were scattered, often illiterate or dead. The only sources available were the men themselves, who had every incentive to embellish, and the local papers that had already printed the embellished version, which were now being cited as corroboration. The myth was citing itself. Now think about what this cost, because it cost something real. In the spring of 1884, a county somewhere in the Southwest is dealing with a genuine problem. Cattle are being stolen from small ranchers, not in dramatic raids. Just quietly, a few head at a time, over months. The men doing it are well connected. They have friends on the county commission. The local paper has not printed a word about it. A group of small ranchers ride to the county seat to file a formal complaint. They wait 2 days to see the relevant official. They are told the matter will be looked into. They ride home. Nothing changes. 3 more months pass. The rustling continues. Eventually, one of the ranchers, a man who has read the same newspaper stories as everyone else, decides that the official channels have failed and something more direct is required. He has absorbed, through years of reading, the lesson that individual action resolves what institutions cannot. That confrontation is legitimate when the system fails. That a man who stands his ground is a man who commands respect. He makes a decision that costs him everything. That is the real damage of the myth, not that it made violence seem glamorous in some abstract sense, but that it provided a specific, actionable model, a framework for decision-making that was built on distorted information and adopted by real people in real situations. Men died because of stories. Not because of the events the stories described, because of the stories themselves. But it gets worse. The newspapers were not the only engine running. By the 1880s, the dime novel was an industrial product. Publishers in New York and Chicago were producing tens of thousands of copies of cheap, paperback narratives about Western heroes, outlaws, gunfighters, and frontier lawmen. These were sold at newsstands, general stores, train stations, and through mail order. They reached every corner of the country. Children read them. Factory workers read them. Farmers in Ohio read them. The stories in these novels were not reporting. They were not even loosely based on documented events most of the time. A writer sitting in a rented room in New York constructed a plot, borrowed a name from the newspapers, filled in the rest with imagination, and sent it to press. The result was fiction, but it was published in a format that looked like fact, used names that readers recognized as real, and described places that existed. The line was gone. A reader in 1884 could not easily distinguish between a newspaper account and a dime novel. Both were printed text. Both told stories about real-seeming people. Both were sold at the same counter. The conventions of journalism and fiction had not yet separated cleanly, and the publishers had no interest in helping readers make the distinction, because the reader who believed the story was a confirmed buyer. So the mythology grew in 2 directions simultaneously. The newspapers gave it a factual foundation, even when the facts were curated and shaped. The dime novels gave it emotional depth, narrative structure, heroic arc. The 2 fed each other. A notable gunfight covered in newspapers provided material for a dime novel. The dime novel, widely read, increased the fame of the newspaper subject. The famous man gave more interviews, which newspapers printed, which inspired more novels. The machine was self-sustaining within a decade. And here is the question that should be sitting in your mind by now. Who decided which men became legends and which men disappeared? Because Not every man involved in frontier violence became famous. Not every sheriff, not every gunfighter, not every outlaw. Some names ran constantly through the papers and the novels. Others, equally involved in equally dramatic events, barely registered. What made the difference? It was not the violence itself. It was access. The men who became legends were men who either controlled their own narrative, cultivated relationships with writers and reporters, or happened to serve the interests of someone who did. A man with good connections in the business community of a major town had a better chance of becoming a legend than a man of equal or greater skill and danger who had no such connections. It was not merit. It was proximity to the machinery of image-making. A man who spent a decade as a deputy in a small county, who settled dozens of disputes peacefully, who prevented violence through reputation alone, who never fired a shot in anger, appeared in no novels and no Eastern papers. He was too quiet. His work did not translate into scenes that could be narrated. A man who shot someone in front of witnesses got covered. Whether he was brave or desperate, or simply faster, did not matter to the copy. The selection process filtered for the dramatic, which meant it filtered against the truth. Small towns across the West in this period had crime rates, but they also had most of the same patterns as towns anywhere. Disputes were usually settled through argument, negotiation, or departure. Most people, most of the time, were working, not fighting. A sheriff spent most of his time on paperwork, on livestock disputes, on drunk and disorderly arrests, on enforcing municipal ordinances about where horses could be tied. The life was unglamorous, bureaucratic, and occasionally dangerous in the way that all jobs involving human beings occasionally become. None of that appeared in print. It was not the story anyone wanted. So an entire generation of Americans built their understanding of what the West was like on the 5% of events that the selection machinery decided were worth covering. The other 95% did not exist in the public mind. This matters because myths are not passive. They shape expectations. They shape policy. They shape how people behave when they encounter situations that resemble the myth. A town in Texas in 1888 is considering whether to pass an ordinance restricting the carrying of firearms within the town limits. It is a practical question. Other towns have passed similar ordinances. The evidence from those towns suggests that reducing the number of armed men in close proximity to each other and to alcohol reduces the incidence of violent incidents. But the debate in this town is not purely practical. It is filtered through the mythology. Half the men in the room have read stories, novels, newspaper accounts that tell them armed men are the last line of defense against chaos, that a disarmed community is a vulnerable one, that the heroic individual with a weapon is the guarantor of order. The ordinance fails. 6 months later, a man is killed in a saloon disagreement. The man who killed him had no particular skill or history. He was just drunk and armed and angry. The newspaper covers it as a tragedy, not as a consequence of the mythology, not as the result of a decision made in an environment shaped by distorted narratives, just as a tragedy. A moment of senseless violence, unconnected to anything. And the machine rolls on? Here is something that almost never gets discussed. The people building the myth did not only shape what Americans thought about the West, they shaped what Westerners thought about themselves. A miner in a Colorado camp in 1879 was not living inside a legend. He was living inside a job. He worked with a pick in a tunnel. He slept in a tent or a rough bunkhouse. He ate badly and drank when he could afford to. His relationship to violence was mostly the fear of it, not the practice of it. Most men in these settings were not gunfighters. Most were not outlaws or lawmen. Most were just workers trying to survive a difficult situation. But they were reading the same newspapers and the same novels as everyone else. They were consuming the same mythology about themselves, about their region, about what kind of place they lived in. And that mythology created a self-image that had consequences. If the story said that men of the West were hard, independent, unafraid of violence, and resistant to outside authority, then men living in the West began to perform those qualities. Not because they naturally felt them more than anyone else, because the story said they should. Because the story said that was what this place required. Social identity is partly a performance. People shape themselves to match the stories told about their group. And in the 1870s and 80s, the story being told about Western men was very specific. The dime novels were not documenting a culture. They were creating one. A young man arriving in a new territory for the first time had no reference point. He had left somewhere familiar and landed somewhere foreign. The social rules were unclear. The hierarchy was not established. In that vacuum, the cultural material he had brought with him, the stories, the novels, the newspaper accounts, became the map. He did not know how men actually behaved in this place, but he knew how the stories said they should behave. And he acted accordingly, which meant the stories were not wrong about behavior because they caused the behavior they described. This is not circular logic. It is how culture actually works. Narrate the norms. Watch the norms get performed. Then narrate the performance as if it confirms the original story. But it gets worse still. The mythology was not racially neutral. It never was. The selection of who became a legend, who appeared in the dime novels and the newspaper features, who got held up as the ideal of Western manhood, was not accidental. It was narrow. The heroic archetype of the American West, as constructed by this machinery, was a specific kind of man, and the men who did not fit that archetype were either villains, background figures, or simply absent from the narrative entirely. The population of the actual American West was not narrow. There were Mexican communities who had been there for generations before Anglo settlers arrived. There were Chinese workers who built the railroads and then were systematically excluded from the towns those railroads created. There were black men, many of them veterans of the Civil War, who worked as cowboys, lawmen, and settlers in numbers that the mythology almost completely erased. There were indigenous populations whose entire existence was being violently disrupted while newspapers in eastern cities were publishing stories about the heroic taming of the frontier. The taming. That word appeared constantly. The language of progress. The wilderness made orderly. The savage made civilized. The people being described as the wilderness, as the thing to be tamed, had their own accounts of what was happening. Those accounts did not reach the wire services. They did not appear in the dime novels. They had no access to the machinery. A man sitting in a newspaper office in New York in 1883 deciding which Western stories to print was not making moral decisions about what to erase and what to amplify. He was making commercial decisions. He was asking what his readers wanted, and his readers wanted the version that confirmed a particular national story about expansion, destiny, and the righteousness of what was being done. The erasure was complete enough that a century later most people could recite the names of famous gunfighters from this period and have no idea that the communities who were displaced to make room for those men's fame even existed in the same places at the same time. That is not ignorance. That is the result of a sustained, if not entirely intentional, campaign of narrative exclusion. And here is the question that should be uncomfortable. The myth is still running. Not in the same form, not through dime novels and telegraph wire services, but the infrastructure of the legend is still functional. The films, the television series, the video games, the political rhetoric that reaches back to the imagery of the frontier, the lone individual, the righteous gunfight. The aesthetic of the West as a place where things were simpler, where right and wrong were clear, where a man with enough nerve could impose justice on a chaotic world. That imagery is not harmless nostalgia. It is a live cultural force. It informs decisions. It shapes how people think about authority, about community, about violence, about who deserves to be the hero of any given story. And it is still built on the same distorted foundation that the newspapers of 1875 laid. 30 seconds of gunfire, a century and a half of consequences. Go back to 1881 and that dusty street. The smoke has cleared. 3 men are on the ground. The survivors are breathing hard. Someone needs to go get the doctor. Someone else is going to tell the story. The doctor can only help 3 people. The storyteller will reach everyone. That asymmetry is the whole problem. The event was small, local, specific. A dispute between men with a specific history in a specific place over specific grievances. Whatever actually happened in those 30 seconds, it was particular. It belonged to a time and a context that cannot be lifted out and made into a general truth. But general truths are what people need. General truths are what they will pay for. So the story gets lifted out. The context falls away. The specific grievances are replaced with something cleaner. Cowboys and outlaws, law and chaos, the lone man and the threatening crowd, and millions of people read it and believe it and carry it home and pass it to their children. The event is over in 30 seconds. The story runs for 140 years. Think about the mechanics of that. Think about what it means that the shape of an entire national mythology about individual identity, about violence, about freedom, about what the American West was and meant, rests on a foundation of curated half-truths produced by financially dependent newspapers, commercially motivated novelists, and the self-interested testimony of men who survived violent events and had every reason to control the narrative of what happened. The foundations were not solid, they were never solid. But by the time anyone was in a position to examine the foundations, the building was already enormous. By the time historians started returning to primary sources, to court records, to letters, to depositions, to the accounts of people who had been excluded from the original story, the mythology had already calcified into something that felt like history, and challenging it felt like an attack. Not an attack on the mythology, an attack on the people who believed it, because a story that runs long enough stops being a story. It becomes identity, challenge the story, and you are challenging who someone is, where they come from, what their history means. That is a much harder conversation than just correcting a few details. This is why the gunfight myth is so resistant to revision, not because the facts are unclear, not because the evidence is inaccessible, but because the story is not functioning as information. It is functioning as identity, and identity does not revise itself easily. A man somewhere in the American Southwest in the 1880s actually lived through something. It was messy and frightening and probably not particularly glorious. He told the story of it in a way that made it glorious because that was the only version anyone would listen to. That version got printed. That version got reprinted. That version got fictionalized. That version got filmed. That version got taught informally to children through 100 years of cultural repetition, what he actually lived through has been impossible to recover since roughly 1883, which raises the last question: does it matter? If a story is false but functional, if it holds a community together, if it provides a model for behavior, if it gives meaning to a difficult past, does the falseness matter? The answer is yes, but not for the reasons people usually give. The story of the heroic West does not only affect how people feel about history, it affects how they evaluate the present. A myth that presents violence as a legitimate and effective tool for imposing order does not stay in the past. It gets applied to the present. A myth that presents the lone individual as more trustworthy than institutions does not stay in the past. A myth that erases whole categories of people from the foundational narrative of a place does not stay in the past. Myths do not retire. They recycle. Every time the imagery of the frontier gets invoked in a political speech, a myth built by commercially motivated newspaper editors in 1880 is doing work. Every time the lone gunfighter is held up as a model of righteous action, a story that was never accurate is being deployed as a template. The 30-second gunfight ended. The men involved are dust. The towns are tourist attractions or parking lots, or just gone, but the story is still running, still shaping, still selecting what gets seen and what gets erased. That is the real duration of the violence, not the seconds in the street, the century in the narrative, and the machinery that built it, the editors, the publishers, the men who survived and understood what a good story was worth. They are gone too, but the machine they built kept running after them. It is still running. It runs on the same fuel it always did. The need to believe the simpler version, the need for the dust to settle and the right man still standing, the need for 30 seconds to mean something clean and final rather than something messy and continuous and unresolved. That need is not a weakness. It is human, but feeding it with distortions has a cost that accumulates over time in policy, in identity, in who gets to be the hero of the national story and who gets written out of it entirely. The gunfight lasted 30 seconds. The lies lasted a century. And if you're watching this and thinking the machinery is gone, that we live in a different era with different tools for distinguishing fact from story, consider that the tools have changed and the incentive structure has not. The audience still needs the simpler version. The people who produce content for that audience still have commercial reasons to provide it. The men who benefit from a particular version of history still have reasons to support it being told. The wire service that carried a distorted story from a southwestern town to New York in 1881 ran on electricity and copper wire. Today it runs on fiber and algorithms. The speed is different. The reach is different. The selectivity is not. A story that confirms what people want to believe travels faster than one that complicates it. That was true in 1880. It is true now. The technology accelerates the dynamic, but does not change it. So what do you do with that? You start by being willing to look at the 30 seconds, not the version that got printed, not the novel, not the film, the actual 30 seconds. Loud, close, chaotic, motivated by grievances that had been building for months in a context of competing economic interests and inadequate legal infrastructure. Men who made decisions under pressure for complicated reasons. An outcome that nobody fully controlled. That is not a hero story. It is a human story. And human stories are harder to hold on to. They require more. They require you to sit with the ambiguity, the context, the consequence. They do not resolve cleanly. They do not end with the right man still standing, but they are true, and truth is slower to build than myth, harder to sell, easier to ignore. It has to be worth building anyway. The dust settled 140 years ago on that street. On the mythology, it is not settled yet. It will not settle as long as the story keeps running in the same direction it has always run, fast, dramatic, and narrow. Slow it down, widen it. Look at what was left on the floor when the story was picked up and carried away. That is where the actual history is. Quiet, covered, patient, waiting for someone to find it worth the trouble.